So my question is kind of a long way around. Is not an amalgam of both positions also legitimate?
It is it is, but when you look at actual policy decisions in China, we don't know whether those are taken today because China's power relative to international structures isn't to the level yet that would allow confronting the West and other powers and such. So if you look at the Chinese decision over on Libya, they didn't veto, they don't veto normally. I don't know if there's ever been a veto. I don't think there's ever been a Chinese veto of a Security Council resolution. They'll negotiate. They'll say, we would veto if you went to this point. If the resolution contained these, we would definitely veto. They never get to that point. So they don't veto. They abstain. Then, in the internal propaganda on Libya, there's been, especially in the last few weeks, since so many dissidents, lawyers, human rights activists, now Ai Weiwei, the artist, have been arrested. There's a discourse that's emerged that's very harsh on Libya, very harsh on the Western intervention in Libya, linking it to actually a lot of things I'm talking about, the threat of global culture or universal 普世的价值, universal values as a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So there are clearly neoliberal elements to Chinese policy today. In the economy, especially, we see it. And so it could be that over the long run, since China will never be in a position to completely thumb its nose at international structure, it could be those will win out. You'll see generational change, people educated in other countries, or people interacting with others, or have an interest in sort of neoliberal outcomes. It could happen. But all the writing by Chinese foreign policy elites, especially security policy elites, suggests to me a realist mindset. And I look as far in any place I can to find writing on that. I don't want to miss anything. Everything I've seen suggests the mentality of the people structuring Chinese foreign policy is realist. But I don't rule out change.
Hi, Professor. I enjoyed your talk. You interrogated a lot from the perspective of government and probably high-level officials' writings. What if you had a chance to interrogate from the level of civil society? Don't you think the assumption would be more, towards the neoliberal, or a neoliberal, if you want, rather than the realist, explanation?
I do think that, but there really isn't a civil society in that sense in China. There's no organized political opposition, right? All groups have to have a party presence, or at least be supervised by the party, have a party backer, a communist party backer. So you don't really have a civil society in that sense. I'll talk when I'm there with people on the street just casually about Taiwan and other issues, and absolutely. There's a great variety. I've had people say to me, I don't care what happens in Taiwan. I've got my own problems to worry about. Don't ever quote me on that, but that's the way I feel. I mean, what do I have against them? I don't mind, but they can't vote. They can't express their opinion. They don't shape the foreign policy making or the cross-strait policy making. That could change, but there's no evidence that's going to change anytime soon.
So I was really fascinated about your talk about soft power and the use of China and China's foreign policy officials on soft power. So what I was wondering was, is Taiwan doing anything similar with regards to soft power to pursue their foreign policy interests?
Oh, absolutely. And they've become actually very effective at that in the last 10 or 20 years. Professor Gold here is the man to ask about that. He's been going to Taiwan since, can I say when? Since the 1970s, the 60s, wow, okay. So they're very active and even effective in that. And then the main thing they can point to is Taiwan's democratization, which has a lot of appeal throughout the world, not only in the United States, but Southeast Asia has a lot of appeal. In fact, Taiwan's democratic and so on. In fact, one of the points that Ma Ying-jeou tries to stress in his meetings with foreign leaders or foreign journalists now is, look, my predecessor, Chen Shui-bian, was a troublemaker, and I'm a peacemaker. I'm a peace builder. I'm doing these things to build peace, and you in Asia or in the United States should appreciate that, and actually people in Asia and the United States do appreciate that. The question is whether people in Taiwan will appreciate it next March, how thoroughly they'll appreciate it, and down the road, whether that kind of appeal that Taiwan has to others in Asia or the United States will be enough to deter Beijing from really pushing for political unification. That's the key. That's what we have to watch. I mean, that's kind of Taiwan's strategy. They know that it would be a disaster if there were a war, just an incalculable disaster. Even if the United States came to Taiwan's assistance, and even if the war was fought to a stalemate, it would just be terrible, unthinkably bad for Taiwan, for China, for the United States, for the world. But so my strategy is appease, facilitate integration, and really hope for the best. Hope for a solution that will not necessarily appeal to current Chinese leaders, but maybe a few years down the road, more moderate Chinese leader, something like that, and will still be acceptable to Taiwan people. Taiwan people may not be able to achieve independence like the DPP wanted, the Democratic Progressive Party under Chen Shui-bian, but maybe something acceptable, not quite as integrated into the PRC as Hong Kong is, something more autonomous. He's hoping for that. We'll just have to see if that's what China wants. And of course, soft power is a key element to his strategy in trying to achieve that objective.
In any kind of rivalry, you don't necessarily advertise all of your capabilities. And I was wondering if that applies to cultural assets. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the differences in which Chinese discuss cultural assets with foreigners, be it a Confucius Institute, and the way they discuss cultural assets within the state apparatus, like a Beijing consensus.
I'm not sure I fully understand your question. Could you rephrase it, please?
You don't always discuss all the cards in your hand for fear of spooking foreigners. So within the Communist Party, do they discuss how they have a great economic model while having a different dialogue or different narratives when discussing their Washington counterparts?
Right, I see. Okay. Yeah, actually there is much more frank discussion, as you could tell by some of the, you would never, some of the things I read, you would never see translated into English for Time magazine or something like that. It would be very rare. Every now and then the Global Times or the English language People's Daily, you could see things like this. Most foreigners won't go to read those things. So there's much more frank discussion inside these publications than there would be outside. Also, when I go to interview people in China who write these sorts of articles, they are much more actually neoliberal when they're talking with me. Then, I mean, there have been occasions when I will have read something that somebody wrote that was kind of really sort of out there, but you would never know it from what they're telling me. And I'm actually, of course, a lot more polite, too, than I might be in another setting, because you've got to make, in an interview, the social encounter come off. You don't want to be hypocritical, but the social encounter has to succeed. So both sides will kind of soften the rhetoric and maybe not entirely disclose what they really think. But that's actually suggests to me not hypocrisy so much as the benefit of diplomacy, including people-to-people diplomacy like straight talk. If people are constantly interacting with each other and forced to articulate their positions with other people who might otherwise be their adversaries, it becomes a lot more difficult to imagine those so-called adversaries in the worst terms. You have to interact with them. You go back to Beijing or Taipei or Washington or wherever, you know, wow, those are actually people rather than just adversaries. And the more and more people from all these societies that do have those kinds of interactions, the more people are forced to reconcile their at least previous private views, like might be expressed in some of these journals, with the public views they have to take to make international relations, including people-to-people relations, succeed.
Hello. Do you think there is possibilities that people in Taiwan just made their own Taiwan's cultural identity other than the whole Chinese cultural identity? And it's going to be difficult for us to unite together for the Chinese culture flourish.
I think people, this is my own view, I've gone to Taiwan a lot over the years, and my sense is that people in Taiwan identify Taiwan, not everybody, but probably this 80% of the population, identify Taiwan as their nation, but China as their civilization. So most people, I think, in the United States identify the United States as their nation, but the West, Western civilization as their civilization. That's my sense of what you see in Taiwan. And for that reason, people don't hate China. They don't hate Chinese civilization. They consider themselves a part of it. They just don't think it's their nation. Just like I don't hate the West. Every now and then I get irritated with France or somebody like that. But I certainly would never hate the West. I'd never get irritated with Italy, that's for sure. Because I identify with the West, but that doesn't mean I want to be ruled from Ottawa or London or something. It just, it doesn't mean I don't like Canadians. I just don't think California should be a part of Canada. So I think it's not a completely apt analogy, but it's the closest I've been able to come to about Taiwan identity. Of course, it's not as developed a national identity as you'd see in the United States, because it's not de jure. According to international law, it's not a nation state, but they've never been a part of the PRC, never been a part of the People's Republic, and really in the last 105-6 years, not ruled, at least more than a year or so, from a mainland government, from a Chinese mainland government, since 1895. Ruled by Japan in a few years when the Kuomintang did not control the mainland, and then separated from the mainland. So it's never been ruled from a mainland government in the last 106 years. And even from 1683 till 1895, it was only loosely a part of the Qing Empire. So it's a very different identity. And I don't think it's easy to imagine that going away, even with integration.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I have a couple of related questions. It's about. You mentioned before about the aggressive Chinese foreign policy, but since Hu Jintao's visit to the U.S., it's been a lot less aggressive. And then, so the question that I would ask is, what do you make of the current U.S. strategy in Asia, which has been articulated by the White House? They've been building consensus about how they've been, we're going to try and emulate the 83 to 86 relationship by building up our allies in the region. Thanks.
Well, I think thank you for the question. I think it points to a really interesting development in U.S.-China relations in the past, since the Obama administration, that distinguishes the current period from any period going back to the late 1970s. When a U.S. presidential administration first comes into office, it's often very tough on China. The candidate will have been tough on China during the campaign. So during the first year in office, the new administration is often very tough on China. But then after a year or two, it moves to the center and becomes more moderate with China, right? This goes back to the Reagan administration, so on, Clinton administration, all the way through Bush too. But the Obama administration has been very different. China was not particularly an issue during the 2008 campaign. The Obama administration came in determined to have very good relations with China, a G2 type arrangement or something like that, found himself frustrated, and has moved in the other direction. So he started off as moderate, has moved into the other direction, has become tougher on China. So you asked me what do I think about that, the first thing I would say as a social scientist is, well, it's interesting new development. Changes the pattern of U.S.-China relations. So it's novel and worth paying attention to. Whether I think it's a good idea, I'm not there in Washington with all the intelligence information and so on, but the touchstone may be if people in Asia who are there on the ground right next to China are inviting the United States back in to play that kind of role, then I think we have to take that very seriously. If people in, of course, Taiwan, which actually has a very good relationship with China now, but Vietnam, Philippines, and so on, South Korea, are worried about China, Japan, of course, in that way, the U.S. should heed its friends and allies' concerns and help them hedge against China's rise. Not necessarily balance against it, but hedge against possible contingency. So it seems like a reasonable policy to me. Aha, a little bit of a...
Okay, my question's, it seems to me a lot of studies and analysis have been done, regarding this issue, both outside and inside of those regions, probably more outside. But we also understand that no matter what is done outside, it's essentially the people within those regions that are making the decisions. And at the same time, whatever decision they make, they need to take the entire globe into consideration. So my question is kind of, how do you feel the balance of the cross-strait issue being original and at the same time global issue?
It's actually more of a global issue now than I think it's ever been before. I mean, Taiwan is actually quite a global actor economically And it has the equivalent of diplomatic missions in, I don't know, a lot of countries that are really de facto embassies, even though they're not called embassies. So both PRC and Taiwan are very globally active. And so it's inescapably a globe-level problem. It's not going to be a problem that I don't think China can imagine it'll be able to ignore the interests and concerns of the United States, Japan, others in Asia. I think it's unavoidably, inextricably a global issue.
The examples you shared with us from your interrogation or survey, my sense was that a lot of those sources were fairly connected to the government or government policy and that type of thing. So I'm curious, if you conducted a similar survey in the U.S. of very similar sources related to the U.S. government to a similar degree, where do you think that would land on that scale you laid out between neoliberal and neo-realist?
Well, I'd obviously be speculating. Some of these people are scholars, not directly connected to the government or the party, probably often party members. They might go to testify or at least provide information at a strategy session where government officials are. I haven't done that study. My sense is that there's a much broader variety of views in the United States, probably more neoliberal views, but of course also realist views. It would depend on the administration. I think the Bush administration was much more realist than the Obama administration, but realism is not missing from the Obama administration, as we know, as suggested by this previous question. So I'd have to punt on that because I haven't done the research, but I imagine it's broader.
So your research focuses a lot on how language can kind of suggest cultural views about whether China's policy is oriented towards neorealism or neoliberalism. And I was wondering how much of this language is intentional and how much of it is actually just inert from the history of Chinese policy speak, which has kind of had its own process. And as a short follow-up, is how much of China's policy language has indicated a degree of change, perhaps, as current events develop and as international relations change?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of Chinese policy speak. In fact, 90% or maybe even 95% of these articles are policy speak, and I just have to go through them until I find the kind of unique, novel sort of takes on things. I think the way events change the content of the Chinese discourse is if the leader, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, adopts a new line or a new emphasis in international affairs, then you'll see very quickly reflected in the discourse of change. So when Hu Jintao unveiled the harmonious world concept starting in April 2005, very soon afterward you saw a lot of people writing about the harmonious world, and it became very elaborate and very well thought through. So rather than, I mean, of course they address events too, but I think this realism is at the core of Chinese thinking. Even the harmonious world, see the way it's often shows elements of realism, realism. I feel pressed to answer quickly, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a stimulating talk.
Thank you.
And which suggests to our delegates that they may have more work to do in peace building than they imagined when they got on the airplanes the other night.
Delighted to play that role.
But though we're ending the formal part of the program, we do have a juice, wine, and cheese reception, so please feel free to interrogate our speaker outside, and please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank
Daniel
you.
Lim.
Thank you. Thank you.